Hello, hello. Okay, so wife's still out of town, and I'm going to get through Leviticus, I think, while she's gone. We are on chapter 25. Kids are in bed, stay asleep. Now, this is one I think Big Bear himself would enjoy. So it talks about the year of Jubilee, the Sabbath year, and a little bit about slavery. There's some parts in this that people will talk about slavery and basically how the Bible, the Israelites are allowed to treat their people differently than foreigner slaves. We'll get into that in a little bit. But we'll start off here with the Sabbath year. A couple homesteaders that my wife follows on YouTube and stuff, I think one or two of them does a land Sabbath. My wife and I were talking about doing that, and that being the year that she gets pregnant again. She has a hard time with pregnancy, so it'd be nice if I didn't have to work out in the garden when she was going through that with the two kids we already have. Anyway, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows or of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your male and female servants. Whatever the land yields. Okay. And the hired worker and temporary resident who lives among you, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. So you just can't harvest it. Like, you can eat it off of the vines and everything, but you can't harvest it. And we'll get into, how are they going to have enough food and all this stuff, because God talks about that. Okay, so Enduring Word Bible Commentary. Keep a Sabbath to the Lord. We are familiar with the idea of a Sabbath of days, where one day out of 7 is especially dedicated to God and his rest. This described a Sabbath of years for the land, where the land received a rest 1 year of 7. That was the worst commentary. Are you serious? That's what we just... All right. I don't have the references and the bibliographies, but as someone who's grown up on a farm, and all my friends went to ag school and all this stuff. Anyway, you can find countless articles and go back in old farmers' almanacs, even about soil crop rotation, everything. If you give the land a year of rest every 7 years, even scientifically that makes sense. It's going to make the land healthier going forward, and you keep doing that every 7 years, you're going to keep the land healthy and the soil nutritious and everything. So scientifically, it just makes sense for you. And I think it's a way of showing faith in God, which we'll get to in a little bit. Here we go. So the Sabbath year, obviously this called Israel to truly trust God. They had to trust God that he would provide enough in the harvest of 6 years to see them through the 7th year of rest. All right. That's, like I said, get yourself a good commentary Bible. I have a few downstairs packed away somewhere. My grandma gets me these all the time. I have I'm in my not even past mid-30s, and my grandma has got me 3 large print Bibles. They're huge. I got 20 Bibles in my house. And most of the time I use the internet. Anyway, the year of Jubilee. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee. Okay. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family, property, and to your own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. If it is a jubilee, for it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. So later on, we'll get into, it'll talk about what the jubilee means for slaves. And it says right here, consecrate the 15th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. Later on, it talks about the difference between foreign slaves and slaves that reside that are of Israel, they're of the line of Jacob, and how the Jubilee applies to them. And it's not clear whether or not it applies. I mean, some people say it's clear, it doesn't apply, but we'll get into it when it goes on later on. But notice this, the 50th year, and this is what's going to get real interesting, is returning to your own property. But in the 50th year, everyone is basically forgiven of their debts, because you sell yourself into slavery is usually how that would work. So whatever the debt, you're free. Your freedom is given to you, and you go back to your land. And we'll talk more about what that means. So the traditional rendering of the name special year is Jubilee, which is ultimately a transliteration of a Hebrew word meaning ram's horn. Proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. The wonderful liberty of Jubilee was joyfully announced through all the land, announcing that all slaves were free. We don't have much of a record of this being observed in the Old Testament. Well, they did fall away from tradition pretty quickly. There may be examples in Nehemiah 8 and 10. Slave laws in Exodus 21, 2 through 6, and Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 18 provide the option of a slave agreeing to remain with his master after 6 years of enslavement. In the Jubilee, even the slave is set free. In the year of Jubilee, moreover, the slave was to be liberated, thus reminding men that they could have no absolute and final property in any human being. The founding fathers of the United States were aware of the principles of the year of Jubilee and the freedom associated with it. On the Liberty Bell, they inscribed the phrase from proclaim liberty throughout the land, but they didn't have a Jubilee year. Each of you shall return to his possession, his property, and each of you shall return to their family. When the trumpet sounded on the Day of Atonement to proclaim a Jubilee, it meant more than the land receiving an extra year of rest. It was a liberation of sorts, which the following verses will proclaim. Land was to return to the family it was originally given to. The people, including slaves, were expected to return home. In the context indicated that what is involved here is property that has had to be sold during difficult times. The former owner was allowed during this special year to retake possession of his land. So we'll get into it. Basically, you are allowed to buy back your family's land on the Jubilee year, no matter what. I mean, it has to be for a fair price. And we'll get into it, they go over that. But the people who are selling it back to you, like, they're not allowed to make a profit off of it. So it'd have to be like the same price that they bought from you. This is the way I understand it. All right, verse 14. If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from... So this is what reminds me of what Big Bear talks about, how, when you're selling property, you don't have to sell it for a large amount. You can sell it to a family who's in need for a fair price, but not the most you could possibly get out of it. And that's what I think they're going to get into here. If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. Okay, so it's all based on these Jubilee and Sabbath years. So knowing that they won't be able to harvest crops and make money on the Sabbath year, you have to factor that in. And knowing when all debts are to be forgiven in the Jubilee year, that you factor that into the math of the price that you're selling it for. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what is really being sold to you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It's just like, be fair with each other. And I think the idea of the Jubilee year keeps, and the Sabbath year keeps you honest with each other, you know, knowing that the debt's going to be forgiven in the Jubilee year. That is how you make the valuation of what you're buying and selling for. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, too bad they didn't do that, right? You may ask, what will we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? Told you they'd get to this. I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. Okay, so again, this is the trust and faith in God that He is going to provide for you in the 7th year. You know, we see this throughout the Bible, going all the way back to Isaac trusting that he's going to be provided a son, become many nations, all this stuff. It's about trusting and having faith that what God says will happen, will happen. You know, giving your first fruits, your first harvest, your best calf, all that stuff. Verse 23, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. This is God. It's not, I love this part because it's not our land. None of it is. You know, there's that old joke. I'm not gonna, it's a church joke. It's embarrassing, but I enjoy it. You know, a scientist is talking to God and he says, you know, we don't need you anymore. We can do anything you've done. We can create life out of dirt as you did. And God's like, oh, no way, really? You can do anything? Yeah, well, show me. So the scientist picks up some dirt and God's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Get your own dirt. Okay, I know. But that's what this reminds me of. It's we don't own the land. It's God's land. Because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. That's why God can kick them out whenever He wants. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. I'll see what that means. Redemption of the land. See if they say anything on that. This redemption of the land was accomplished through the redeeming relative, Hebrew Goel. The Goel was a designated close relative who had the right to do 3 essential things for a clan or family. The goal would redeem a family member sold into slavery. The goal would redeem the family's land or inheritance sold outside the family. Okay, so it's the family member who would... All right. Jesus is the Redeemer. I get what they're going for there. All right. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. If, however, there is no one to redeem it for them, but later on they prosper and acquire sufficient means to redeem it themselves, they are to determine the value for the years since they sold it and refund the balance to the one to whom they sold it. They can go back to their own property. See, this is so amazing to me as somebody who knows all these family farmers and everything, is no matter what, you're allowed to go back to your land. You know, you can, on the Jubilee year, you have the option to go back to your homeland, to the land that your father and grandfathers, you know, reaped from and worked from. And that's a beautiful thing to me, personally. But if they do not acquire the means to repay what was sold, will remain in the possession of the buyer. See, it's all fair until the year of Jubilee. So even before the year of Jubilee, they're allowed to buy it back. Awesome. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and they can then go back to their property. Awesome. You might say it's unfair, but remember, all the buying and selling is based on the number of years since until the next Jubilee. So it is fair, because that is how the valuation of everything is determined. Anyone who sells a house in a walled city retains the right of redemption a full year into its sale. During the time the seller may redeem it. If it is not redeemed before a full year has passed, the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to the buyer and the buyer's descendants. It is not to be returned in the Jubilee. But houses in villages without walls around them are to be considered as belonging to the open country. They can be redeemed, and they are to be returned in the Jubilee. Oh, I bet some real Talmudic stuff started happening when they started building walls around property, around cities, in between the Jubilee years. Oh man, that gets legalistic. The Levites, verse 32, the Levites always have the right to redeem their houses in the Levitical towns. So the property of the Levites is redeemable. That is, a house sold in any town they hold, and is to be returned in the Jubilee, because the houses in the towns of the Levites are their property among the Israelites. But the pasture land belonging to the towns must not be sold. It is their permanent possession. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. It's funny how they say this, like, help your fellow Israelite. And you grab my charger. It says, your fellow Israelite, treat them when they're poor and in hard times as you would a foreigner or sojourner, traveler. And they mean that in a positive way. Like, you're supposed to be on your best behavior when a guest is in your house, when a traveler is in your land. You show extra kindness to them, you know? At least that's what God calls for. And we see that here. It's like, wouldn't you assume that they would treat their own poor better than a foreigner or traveler? But here it's stated that you should treat them as them, you know, in a good way, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who bought... Think of if, like, businesses today followed that law. Like, the poor, you can't sell your goods at a profit for. It's the cost to make it. Whew. You must not... All right. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If any of you, your fellow Israelites, become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. I think that's beautiful too. Your male and... Now again, this is the part where we get to, if Israelites sell themselves to you. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inheritance property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. See, this is where people get mad, because it says your fellow Israelites. But you have to go back to chapter 19, where it talks about how you treat all your slaves. So here it shows there's a distinction between slaves and your Israelite sold people or hired workers. But it already talked about how you're supposed to treat your slaves, and you're supposed to treat them as, what was the phrase? It was like inhabitants of the land. Like, you treat them as you would anyone else. So again, the way I read all my translations is in the Jubilee year, the people, even the foreigner, I feel like it was up to the master, basically. I don't know. I'm sure rabbis and stuff will correct me so harshly and everything, but we'll get into that, maybe. So yeah, so you can bequeath them to... Let's go to the Enduring Word Bible here. My dad's going to say what I wanted to say. Foreign slaves, debt or poverty, did not have the same right as Israelites who went into servitude because of debt. They could be held as slaves for life, assuming their debt or obligation was never paid, though they had to be treated humanely. Exodus 20, 8 through 11. Again, Exodus 19. So that's the same thing. So that's the way I read it, I guess, is you didn't have to set your foreign slaves free on the Jubilee year, but you did, unless they could, you could keep them for life unless they paid back their debt. Because remember, they sold themselves to you. That's how the slavery would have worked, I guess. But you had to treat them humanely. But they did have rules on how you're supposed to treat your slaves. Exodus 21 specifically says that kidnapping a man to sell him was a sin and not allowed in Israel. Later, the prophet Amos rebuked Tyre for their traffic in slaves as violation of the covenant of brotherhood. This is a subtle yet important difference between slavery as it was and is commonly practiced and slavery as regulated in the Bible. Most slavery, ancient and modern, was actually a form of kidnapping, the taking and imprisoning of person against their will, as regulated in the Bible and as practiced in some other ancient cultures. Slavery was received willingly, yet you sold yourself into slavery. Or, in the case of war, was an alternative to death. In ancient Israel, people from other cultures were not kidnapped and enslaved. So yeah, that's what like Thomas Jefferson was fighting the Barbary pirates. There's all these kidnappings into slavery. And yes, I know that's what happened with Africans coming to America too. That's sad. That's the way it was for a lot of slavery. If you follow the biblical law, that's not how slavery would have been. And as we know with Big Bear and anyone who's just aware of what's going on, we're all slaves. We're all slaves because you're debt. Debt is you sell yourself into slavery, But we've almost been kidnapped into it because a lot of us have been in it, the debt, slave to the system since birth. And you may be like, well, it's not slavery because you're free, you have all these things. I mean, debatable. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich and any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them. So basically, even if you're a rich foreigner in your land, you still have to follow our laws. An uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them, or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. They and their buyers are to count the time from the year they sold themselves up to the year of Jubilee. The price for their release is to be based on the rate paid to a hired worker for that number of years. Sounds fair? If many years remain, they must pay for their redemption a larger share of the price paid for them. Man, no wonder they're so good at math. If only a few years remain until the year of Jubilee, they are to compute that and pay for their redemption accordingly. They are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. So if you're a rich foreigner, you still have to follow our laws, right? Simple, right? Even if someone is not redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children are to be released in the year of Jubilee. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay. So, again, Leviticus is not the most interesting book, but if you can read it with an open mind and apply it logically to today, I'm not saying, how do I put this? I am saying apply it to today. I'm not necessarily saying word for word, but you understand that if we applied how, okay, slavery is debt. We are all slaves. If there is a year of Jubilee, if this is how we treated one another, if we allowed people to go back to their property, to always be able to buy back at a fair price, think about the honesty and the fairness that comes along with the system that they're setting up here. Now, again, it constantly is getting corrupted and they're not following these laws. That's what always happens. But if you read these laws, especially for this culture at the time, this is so big, like so big as far as not being able to take advantage of anyone else. Anyway, that's the way I read it. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, evening, or good night. I think my son might be waking up, so God bless.